Thank you everyone for being here this morning on September 30th on a bit of a rainy day. But what we're going to do today is learn more about the theory of change process and planning. And we have Julia Gittleman, who's going to give us a very in-depth overview and context for theory of change and how it can be applied to your organization. But also what we want to do is encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. The slides will be shared afterwards, but instead of holding your questions to the end, please certainly raise your hand or ping me or drop it in the chat because we want to be able to address questions as they come up during the presentation. And what we'll start with, well, actually, I'll pass it on to Julia first, but we will start with some introductions. So here you go, Julia.
Great, thanks, Eric. Hi, everybody. It's nice to be here. Nice to meet you all. My name is Julia Gittleman. I'm a not-for-profit consultant that's been around Boston for many, many years at this point. I'm one of the old ladies in town. And I work with community-based grassroots organizations in a variety of ways. One of my favorite ways to work with them is around planning and specifically a lot of work around theory of change. So when Eric and Dominique asked me if I could do this, I was excited to jump at the opportunity. I think we're at a particularly important point in many organizations' work to think about planning. And in addition to theory of change, I'm also going to talk a little bit about scenario planning, which you may be hearing about, because that's what a lot of folks are talking about, and then how both those kinds of planning processes connect to strategic planning, because a lot of people are talking about that too. So I'm going to cover a bunch of different things. I have been working in Boston for over 25 years. I am very highly committed to working with grassroots organizations. I do a lot of work with the arts community and with organizations serving young people and families in Boston. And I use the She series. So I was thinking we could just go around and quickly introduce ourselves, just give your name, your organization, your pronouns. And if you want to just say very, very briefly, if there's one thing that you're hoping to get out of today, then I can make sure that I address those themes specifically, and maybe we could just go around and call on each other because our boxes all look different. So Andy, you're to my right, so I'll start with you if that's okay.
Okay, hi, I'm Andy. I am the program manager for Sibling Connections. We run programming for siblings separated by foster care. I use she, her pronouns, and I had never heard of the theory of change. So I'm new to the nonprofit world, so I'm just looking to get a basic understanding of what that is. I'll call on Lily.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Happy to be here. I use she, her pronouns. I've done a theory of change. So I'm the ED for the Resilient Sisterhood Project, and we focus on women of African descent reproductive health, primarily diseases of the reproductive system, but we do that through a whole social justice lens to look at all forms of social determinants of health to ground the work that we do. So I have a theory of change for RSP, but it's been done over maybe 8 years ago. So I think it's kind of like, this is a time to perhaps for a redo and update and just to really learn where there are things out there. Thank you. So I will call on Ruth. Hi, Ruth.
Hi. I'm Ruth Burson, Refugee Immigration Ministry. We work with congregations of all different faiths to create small groups that help people that are arriving as asylum seekers to be integrated into the community. We also have ESL classes and provide chaplaincy services in the detention center. Okay, I'll call on Linda.
Good morning.
Hi.
I'm Linda Freeman. I'm a board member with Hawthorne Youth and Community Center, and the pronouns are she and her or hers. I've been with Hawthorne for probably over maybe 15 years. I grew with the late Samantha Sad, the program coordinator. very grassroots. What she saw probably in her upbringing and as time went on brought her to Hawthorne, thinking and applying what is most vital and important for the youth and the families and the community as well. She continued that, and Hawthorne's mission is the same. It continues that and will improve upon or modify and adjust as time goes on. And to say the least, I miss her.
Yeah, thank you.
And I will move it to, let's see, Cheryl Cummings.
Hi, good morning. This is Cheryl Cummings, and I run an organization called Our Space, Our Place. We work with, we provide an after-school and career exploration program for kids who are blind and low vision. Pronouns are she, hers. So I think when we were setting up the organization, we had some ideas around absolutely about its purpose and the outcomes we wanted to see for the students who participate. But it's been 15 years ago, and so we're definitely at a point where we need to look at that again and figure out ways of better articulating what exactly we're doing, or the impact that we're trying to have on our students. Fatima? Did Fatima already go?
No, I can go next. Hi, this is Fatima. I use she, hers pronouns. I am the executive director of Muslim Justice League. So we are a small organization that's been around for just 5 years, and we focus on racial justice work, specifically about policing and surveillance of marginalized communities. And when we were initially founded, it was mostly attorneys on our board. And, you know, we had some sort of theory of change, but really was not in use or in practice. And so now that we're focusing a lot more on grassroots community organizing, we're trying to think of, how to formalize sort of the new theory of change that we're working from. And I also happen to be on the board of an organization that's doing strategic planning right now, and so also really helpful to think about, like how do you update your theory of change, or like move forward with it as you're going through that kind of process.
Great.
I will pass to LaToya.
Hello, everybody. My name is LaToya Gale, and I'm an entrepreneur in residence at Boston Schools Fund this year. I previously was executive director at Boston School Finder, and I have a basic understanding of theory of change, and so I wanted to just dig in more to it as I'm launching a new organization over this next year. So I'm going to be in the planning process, and so I wanted to just have exercise that muscle, strengthen that muscle as I'm planning this year.
Let's see, who hasn't gone yet? Lisa, do you want to go?
Thank you. I'm Lisa Piscatelli. I'm the Executive Director of the Attleboro Area Interfaith Collaborative. And my pronouns are she, her. I've been with nonprofit, doing nonprofit work for nearly 18, 20 years, affiliated in a couple different organizations. My organization focuses on hunger relief. We're a safety net organization, so we wrap around some other assistance, particularly for the homeless. And now with COVID, trying to stabilize folks in their housing and all of what that means. Our impact this year is more than twofold. We used to serve around 385 emergency meals per week. We're now serving 1,000 emergency meals per week. So huge change. Wanted to take this particular training because our prior strategic plan was to lead us through 2020, and we were getting ready to be thinking about the next phase, and yet sort of everything that we do has been impacted, and so now what? So trying to equip and assist our board discussions, this will be very helpful.
Great, thank you. And Divya, is that how you pronounce your name? Sorry.
Hi everyone, good morning. My name is Divya Chaturvedi. I'm the co-executive director at Saheli, which is a domestic violence service agency primarily serving South Asian survivors of domestic violence. I'm here to learn about theory of change. We are seeing changes in our organization and in the clientele that we are, survivors that we are dealing with. We're getting from other demographics. We've seen an increase in Arab survivors coming for our services. We share some similar cultural, similar culture. So we're seeing an increase in those survivors, and we want to understand, I just want to understand what this means and, how we can kind of, do it in our organization. Thank you.
Wonderful, great, thank you. And Dominique, do you want to introduce yourself? Everybody knows you, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm Dominique. I'm the Program and Office Administrator for the Lenny Zakim Fund. And I've heard about theory of change in my area, but I've never actually gone into the details of it. So I'm really looking forward to seeing and hearing more about it.
It's very relevant for foundations too. I've done some work with
Yes.
foundations. They need to always think about how they're trying to make an impact too. Great, and Eric, do you want to say anything before I jump in?
No.
Okay, great. All right, well, it sounds like we're all sort of on the same page, which is great. So as Eric had said at the beginning, feel free to either write questions in the chat and Eric or Dominique will stop me. I am a fast talker, as you may already be able to tell. So if there are questions along the way or I'm going too fast, feel free to say, Julia, slow down or explain that more. And then also, this presentation will definitely be sent to you, so you don't need to take notes, but feel free to scribble as you go if you want. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. And turn this to slides. And here we go. Okay, so theory of change. This is a planning process. One of the backdrops to this that I'll say to you is that I got into theory of change work because my work previously has been around measurement and evaluation, and I do a lot of work with community-based organizations, helping them figure out how do you measure success, how do you define success, how do you set up simple, accessible, affordable systems to measure your outcomes. And what became clear in my work is that you can waste a lot of time measuring your outcomes if you aren't really clear about what your model actually is, and that if your model really makes sense for who you are as an organization, then it'll make a lot more sense to measure outcomes. And that's how I ended up getting into theory of change work. So the goals for today are pretty clear, and actually I want to move my pictures over so I can see my screens better. I'm going to make sure that you all know what the theory of change process is and help you to figure out how your organization could engage in this work if you want to. And what you'll learn as a result of developing one. I also will show you some final documents and help you understand what are all the various components of a theory of change process. Let's see here. Oh. Why am I not moving ahead? Sorry, let me figure out why that didn't work right. Okay. Everybody still hear me fine?
Yes. What are you trying to? What?
It's hard. But the problem is that with the slideshow, I can't see the pictures at the same time, which I don't like to do. So I want to be able to see people while I'm doing my presentation. So I'm trying to see, what are you seeing right now?
It's in speaker view, but we can see you.
I want to be able to see you while I do my presentation. That's what I'm trying to figure out.
When you share screen at the top, one of your view options should be standard with gallery after you share it.
In PowerPoint, I mean
in Zoom.
In Zoom, that's what it needs to be. So share screen. Sorry, people, this is where I'm not as experienced. Here's my PowerPoint. And then where does it say that, in advanced or speaker view?
Well, you have to share it first, because then
Okay.
it changes your view.
There's I'm sharing. So it's sharing now?
No, not yet.
I'm clicking on it. All right, now it's not working. Oh, there. Okay, hold on. And now where do I find that view?
So up at the top, does it say view options for you?
Probably more.
Either the top right or kind of near the middle.
No, let's see. I'm sorry, people. Remote control, annotate, pause, share, new share, more. No. All right, well, can you see this now?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, I'm just gonna have to.
There's a box that says view in the upper right corner. If you click that, will it help?
Box in the upper right corner.
Yeah, it might not be in her view, so.
Looking one more time. Chat, record, disable, show names, hide video panel. No, I don't see the option. Okay, well, I'm going to keep going. So you're looking at the final E screen that you can see now?
Yes.
Okay, so continuing on, you're going to see how you can think about completing your own TOC. We're going to talk about alignment briefly, and then at the very end, as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about how strategic planning, scenario planning compare to theory of change work. Oh, see, now I'm on this, and it's not letting me move. That's what I'm trying to figure out.
You're not in screen slideshow view. So down at the bottom right, you can. Yep, play from current slide.
Oh, there. Okay. All right, so what is a theory of change? A theory of change is basically your story, which is how you communicate with the world about what your organization is trying to do or how it's trying to change the world. You want to make sure that you can explain how your group believes that change will take place, and you're fundamentally trying to link outcomes and activities that are going to explain to the world how you're going to make that change and why those changes are expected to come about. So it's very much about telling your story in a way that people can understand and that explains the unique nature of who your organization is. One of the things that people ask me a lot is, what am I going to learn by doing this? What am I going to get out of by doing a theory of change? What questions will be answered as a result of the process? And here's an example of the things that you're going to learn when you undergo a theory of change. One of the first things you're going to be able to understand and clearly explain is who is your organization seeking to serve, or who will benefit from the program services that you're offering, or basically who is your target population. And this can often be one of the harder things for folks to focus on, because sometimes when you go through a process like theory of change, you realize that your target population isn't really exactly who it is that you want to be focusing on, and it means making some changes here, which can be very challenging. Another question that will be answered is, what benefits are you seeking to achieve? Or as I like to say it, what does success look like? And as you'll see when we go through the process, being able to explain what success looks like and understand what it is really one of the most fundamental aspects of what comes out of a theory of change. How will you know when you achieve things, which you also have to be clear, in addition to what does success look like, how long do you need to work with people for, and how much service do people need to receive in order for you to actually achieve that success? So if you're working with a young person in a school setting and you're trying to help them move forward on some kind of academic goal or on some kind of artistic goal, it's probably not a one-time session, it's over a longer period of time, and you need to define how much you need to provide in order to say, here's how we know we've been successful. You need to be explaining what are your activities and strategies, being able to really clearly explain what's happening in your program. And then what's really critical about theory of change is understanding the context and the basic assumptions. So why do you think this model makes sense? What is your rationale in thinking? What research is behind it? What other policy situations exist? And what's the context in which your work needs to happen? And those are really critical aspects of doing theory of change planning. Another question that people ask me all the time is, when should my organization do a theory of change? And it's a process and it's a planning engagement. So it requires some significant time commitment. And in order for you to do that, you need to really make sure that it's a good use of your time. So here are some examples of instances where groups decided it was a good time to do a theory of change. One, when changes are happening externally and you really need to examine how you are operating. So things are happening around you, like right now in our crazy world, and you realize it's a time to step back and reflect on, are there changes to the way we operate that we need to consider in order to maximize our effectiveness? Two, when you're thinking about changing your model, which can also happen as a result of external factors, but it also can happen for different reasons. Changes in your community, changes in your target population, changes in your staff, changes in your leadership. All of these things might occur that would involve you thinking about changing your model. Three, you realize in looking at your outcomes that you haven't been achieving what it is you want to achieve, and you want to make some adjustments. You want to step back and reflect and think about that. And four, when you're thinking about doing a strategic plan. Recently, several times organizations have come to me and said, we're thinking about doing a strategic plan, but we want to make sure that our model makes sense first. And so they embark on a theory of change process prior to doing their strategic plan. And I have found those engagements to be incredibly successful. So that's one thing to think about if you are thinking about starting a strategic plan, is to start it first by doing a theory of change. Here is a view of what are some of the components you're going to see when we walk through the process, and the examples I'm going to share with you, components of what include the theory of change. You will write in your theory of change what your mission statement is, but you will not change your mission statement. Mission statements should stay relatively consistent. The one time where they often are reflected on and changed is through a strategic planning engagement. But on a final theory of change documentation, you will make sure that your mission statement is there. You'll understand and explain and clarify who your target population is, as I mentioned, and then these other things as well, as you'll see in the examples coming. You'll define what short-term and intermediate-term outcomes look like, and then you fundamentally will explain what a long-term outcome is, which is, again, what does success look like for your organization? What is your long-term impact for after a client or a participant in your organization has left you? How is their life different? How are things moving ahead differently? Ultimately, what does success look like? That's the way you start when you do theory of change work. So here is a summary table. There's two different slides, first half and the second half, that explains what are the different components and how you actually define them. And I'm not going to go read through this, because when you get this slideshow from Lenny Zakim Fund, you'll be able to scribble on it yourself. But it goes into significant detail what all the various different descriptive sections of a theory of change include. I think the thing I'm going to skip over mission statement, because I think most folks know what that is. When it comes to target population, though, one of the clearest, most important things to figure out is who it is that you're serving and why those particular individuals, and who is it, therefore, that may not be a good fit. And this has been, when I've led these processes for groups in the past, one of the hardest things for folks to do, is to be able to say, you know, historically, we've let anybody in the door, but we've realized that we're most successful for working with this particular population. And maybe it's time to be clear about why we think we can really help these folks and not necessarily be as effective with these folks. It can be a very challenging part of the conversation, but also a really important one in terms of really refining and refocusing and doubling down on where you can truly have an impact. And so it's a really important part of the conversation. Program description is, pretty straightforward. It's really clarifying exactly what it is that your services provide. What are the elements of the program? Are you offering classes? Are you offering food services? Are you doing healthcare? What's the frequency of the services that are offered, which is sometimes referred to as program dosage, which is how often do young people or do a target population folks work with you, and duration, which is how long they work with you. It is very hard to make sure that you're really providing the services you are if you don't define the dosage and duration for what constitutes your program service delivery model, and also what constitutes program completion. Because fundamentally, it's really hard to measure any kind of outcome and define success if you don't know when you're done, if you don't know when you've actually been successful at providing the services that you said you would. And then the other part of theory of change are all these different outcomes. And as I said before, if you skip down to that third line, the targeted long-term outcomes, that's really what you start with, where you define very clearly what does long-term success look like. And then you go back to the beginning with target population and programs and services. And then you define your short-term and your intermediate outcomes. Short-term usually happens when a program participant is engaged in your process. So it can often be for 6 months or for a semester, or in the case of programs that work with young people, potentially for a school year. Intermediate often speaks to sort of when folks have been with you for some significant amount of time, so maybe for a year or two. And long-term, as I said, is when they're no longer with you, when they've left the program and they've moved on, and you're really trying to measure whether they've achieved the goals that you set out for them. The last row here is about the interplay between all these elements. And one of the things that's very powerful after you're done is to have some kind of graphic representation. And I'm going to give you an example of a graphic that a wonderful organization here in Boston created after we did their theory of change process that helps to really draw and represent what their rationale is and how all these various different components come together. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples right now. One of them is in a table format and one of them is in a visual diagram, but I think that they will help you understand a little bit more what these various pieces are. So the first one is Scholar Athletes, which is a community-based organization that works with kids in the Boston Public Schools, and they've been working in Springfield and also in Everett, young people who identify as athletes, but who are also trying to finish their high school diploma. And they really did a very thorough and detailed theory of change process a few years ago that led to a pretty major reworking of their program model. So here's their table. And I know this is very small font. And again, when you get the presentation, you can look through this more thoroughly. But as you can see, they have their organization mission right up at the top. And they included a program goal as well, because they felt like their mission was a little bit vague and they wanted to be a little bit more specific around what their actual goal is. But each one of these columns, we went through meeting by meeting and refined and reflected on what were their target population and what should their target population be. What is their rationale for why their program makes sense, which is under their assumptions column. Very clearly refined and reflected on what are their strategies and activities. And as you can see here, they described their 3 core areas, and then they went through definition of what it means to be a participant, and then they talked about what the varying services were for the different grades that the young people were in. They documented their outputs, which is how much service people got, and then they very clearly clarified their short-term and their intermediate outcomes, and then they basically were very clear about long-term success, that as a result of being a member, they are empowered to achieve personal success in their future education and career goals, and they will demonstrate this by having successfully implemented their post-secondary education plan or having a career plan 1 year post-high school graduation. So they're very clear about when they would want to know what long-term outcome would look like and when it would be accomplished by. One of the things I always say to folks is around that long-term outcome column, it should be able to be measured, but you probably will not be measuring it because it's a year after or sometime after somebody has left your program. But it should be concrete enough that if you had resources to go out there and find your former program participants, you actually could know if you accomplished those outcomes. The short-term and intermediate, though, absolutely need to be things that are clarified enough that you can actually measure them. And then after you've gotten this written out and clarified, then you can be sure that you know that you've gone out and measured and set up a system for measuring your short-term and intermediate outcomes. Is that clear? And do people have questions? Anybody? All right, I'm going to keep going. Here is the visual that I was talking about, the Height Square Task Force drew. And this gives you a beautiful representation of their theory of change that we went through a whole planning process. We explained the various different pieces, and then they were able to create this pathway themselves, this drawing themselves internally. One of the things to think about, if you want to look at this more clearly, is you can go to their website, which is www.heightsquare.org/r-model. And I'll happily send that to folks so they can look at this more in detail. But as you can see, all the same exact components are here. They've got their mission up at the top. They've got their target population around their youth and their neighborhood. They have two very distinct sets of programs that they run. They go down visually to what they do, which is their service activities, and they've got Jóvenes en Acción and their creative development, community engagement, and college success. They have three distinct areas of programming. Then what we achieve, which is their outcomes for both their youth and their community. And then their assumptions, which is down at the bottom, which is that High Square Task Force assumes that if we provide bum, 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 then these changes will occur. So that's their assumptions and context section right down there. And I think that they did an absolutely beautiful job here of really explaining clearly and showing clearly in a very attractive visual all the different components of what's involved in the theory of change. Any reactions or thoughts about this? Questions?
The layout is very appealing. It makes you want to really dig in.
Right. I thought I mean, they did this internally. They didn't even use a professional design person, but I think they did a really beautiful job here. And this is up on their website. So if you go to High Square Task Force website and you go to like About Us under their program model, you click on this, and they do a rolling things where the box at the top opens and then it rolls down, and it's just visually very clear and appealing. And I think they did a really nice job. So now that you have a general sense and overview of what are the components, one of the questions is who should actually participate in the process and how would a process go forward? So one of the things you need to think about are who are the key players. Obviously your central staff are central to who you would involve in a theory of change planning process. People often ask me, should board be on it? And I go back and forth on this. One of the things about the way these sessions usually work is that I organize them the way that I do them is meeting with folks over a very regular scheduled set of meetings, usually alternating weeks. So one week we have a theory of change planning meeting. The next week I take notes and get folks back with the homework for the next one. So it's every other week. And it's often very challenging from a scheduling standpoint, and board historically are not necessarily available during the day, which is when we hold the meetings for staff. Now, in this crazy era of COVID, people might be able to participate differently than they may have previously. But historically, I often say to folks, boards are more involved in strategic planning. Theory of change is much more focused on the staff. It may be, though, that you want at least a single board representative to be part of the process. And then if you have community representation too, if there are folks in your community that have been very involved in your organization, it's great to involve somebody if it makes sense. But basically understanding who those key decision makers are and making sure that they're at the table is important. In terms
Julia,
of yes.
Question on the key players and the others, and I know you're talking about it now. So key volunteers would be good for this group, but and perhaps some partners, active partners. Would you ever have clients participate in any way?
That is such a good question. I mean, I think it's so critical to have client voice in as many different aspects of organizations as you can. I think the key thing is that staff needs to be able to comfortably really dig into where they have had success historically and where they haven't. And so there may be some challenges. And so in terms of picking the right client, I think that would be critical, so that it's got to be a safe space where people are comfortable digging into, you know, we haven't been as effective working with these kinds of folks, or we haven't been as effective under these circumstances. So if you have a volunteer or a client who you feel has been around enough and they've got to be able to take it out of just their own unique experience and be able to look at it from a more collective, organization-wide perspective, then I think that would be fine. But
So perhaps a former client might work.
That could be perfect, actually. Again, it's so much about their ability, as we all are challenged as human beings, to step out of just our own unique vantage point and look at things more collectively. But if you find somebody who has that capacity, I think that would be fabulous if you could find.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And please keep interrupting like that, because as you were aware, I'm only seeing my screen. I'm not able to see your wonderful faces, unfortunately. In terms of the right number of folks, this is another, it's as much logistical as anything else. It's effective if you have as many different perspectives as possible there. So you don't really want fewer than 6 to 8 people, but any more than 8 to 10 can be challenging from a facilitation perspective, and you want to make sure that there's plenty of room for everybody's voices to be heard. So I usually say to folks around 8 is ideal, if that feels right given the size of your organization. That you guys often run relatively small organizations, and so you may not have a huge number of staff, and so it may be smaller, and that's perfectly fine. Okay, so you've decided this is what you want to do. You've gone through this process of where you've refined all these different things. How do you use it once you've created one? Once you've reflected on these various components and gotten some clarity and created either a table like you saw or a visual, one of the things I said before is you might adjust your target population. So you'll have a much clearer sense of who you should be serving, or who you are serving, who you should be serving, and who you need to start thinking about you're not as effective with. Two, I've seen organizations do a lot of refinement of their models, that they realize that they are doing a huge array of different services and that may be more effective to really drill down deep on a couple of things, or that they're providing services in a way that is missing a key piece. So an organization I did this with recently realized that in the work that they were doing with children and families, they needed to bring on some clinical support. They needed to incorporate some social workers into their staff and provide a model that had a little bit more of a clinical orientation than just more of a case management piece, given the particular needs of their target population. So they really refined their model as a result. And finally, you'll be very clear, or you should be clear about issues around alignment in terms of goals and measurable outcomes. What I mean by that, and the reason why I really spend a lot of time talking with folks about maximizing alignment, is that you guys are busy, you spend a lot of time working very hard, and you really want to make sure that everything through your model makes sense and is in line with each other. So that once you've defined success and you know what success looks like, and then as a result, you know what your outcomes are and that you're figuring out how to measure them, it needs to make sense with what are your program goals and your program model. And the example I give a lot here is because I do a lot of work with youth serving organizations. There's a lot of pressure put on youth serving organizations to focus on educational outcomes. You know, that people want to know that your organization helped a young person succeed in school and graduate from high school and go on to post-secondary education. The problem is that for some programs, that is not what they're trying to accomplish, and that there's a lot of pressure for them to say that's their ultimate measure of success. But when they write down and clarify what it is they're actually providing, it's not aligned. So again, for example, if you're a wonderful, amazing theater organization, and again, I use these examples because I do a lot of work with young people in the arts, and what you're doing is providing them with regular weekly activities and services that are related to participating in theater, they may be creating, better communication skills. They may be demonstrating increased confidence. They may be able to work more effectively in a group, all of which could be aligned with educational outcomes, but their goal isn't around school graduation. It's around helping a young person feel more certain about how to use their voice to communicate and increase their identification as a young and emerging artist. It's not about educational achievement. And so you've got to make sure that there's alignment between what you're ultimately trying to accomplish as an organization and what are the services that you're providing. And I think that's one of the most valuable things that a theory of change can help you guys to get clear on, and also be able to communicate with external audiences about how you're defining success.
Julia, so the outcomes still have to be measurable though. Could you give like an example of so in that case, right, educational outcomes are not in alignment, and the outcomes that they want are more abstract. How would they make those measurable though?
So there are great measures around confidence building, and there are great measures around communication. I mean, there are a lot of great concrete ways that you can measure the impact of a great theater program on a young person who's participated. And those would be the things that you would have under your outcomes. And maybe their long-term outcome, the success for a small theater organization, is that a young person who's completed the program and moved on has a stronger ability to communicate verbally, and has more confidence, and is able to use that as they look to their future career and educational goal setting. So it's not around educational achievement, but it's how they use the skills that they developed to be able to then be able to make decisions better in the future and understand how they can communicate that. So you can measure confidence, and there's some very good standard tools out there. You can measure communication skills, and there's some good, strong tools out there. And the ultimate measure of success, though, is not about graduating from high school. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I mean, do you have a clear set of, from your organization's perspective, a clear ability to sort of say, what does success look like?
I'm not sure. So I'm Andy with Sibling Connections. So like I mentioned at the beginning that I'm kind of new to the nonprofit world. I just started this job a couple months ago. So we work with siblings separated by foster care. I would say that our desired outcome is sustained sibling relationships.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's measurable. I'm just not sure what we're doing to measure that. But sorry, you keep going. I think I'm understanding what you're saying.
Well, and the one thing I would ask you to think about, and I think this would be relevant for everybody, is sustained sibling relationships, because which will lead to ultimately, long-term family stability or overall ability to connect and have necessary support. Like, there's a reason why we think that sibling connections are valuable.
Right, exactly. Well, the goal really is like cycle breaking, right? Like,
exactly.
To heal from childhood trauma.
Exactly. So that's your long-term success. That's ultimately the long-term success of your organization. And the intermediary steps are building the ability for siblings to reconnect and sustain those relationships over time in order to break that cycle.
Right.
So that's a really good example. All right, this was a slide that I originally said to Eric, I'm going to drop, and he said, no, leave it in, because we're going to send you this slide show and you can look at it in more detail. While I was preparing this presentation, though, I read a recent article that had just come out, and it spoke in detail about the limitations of theory of change. And I wanted to just share this with you too, because it's, every process is only as good as the experience that you go through. And sometimes people take things to the nth degree to a point that it's too much. One of the challenges and limitations of a theory of change is they can get so complicated that people lose sight of really what the value is, and that they also can be too rigid. And I think the two limitations or priorities I want to just leave you with, and then you can read this further and go to this article that's referenced here at the bottom, is try to keep it simple, use accessible language, don't use words or concepts that people don't even know what you're talking about, and make sure that when you've completed one, it's valuable to you. You don't get so caught up on it that you become rigid around its application. It should be a learning tool. You should still be able to experiment, but then you can reflect back at your theory of change and say, okay, we tried something new this year. How did it go? Did it work? Does it mean that we need to go back and rework our theory of change, or does it still fit within it, but we're trying to approach our problem solving in a slightly different way? Don't let yourself get too stuck on this is how it's got to be and we can't make any changes, because I really believe that experimentation and learning is absolutely critical. All right, so given the theory of change process, which I've given you an overview to, one of the key questions is, what is its relevance during a pandemic? We are living in a very odd time, and let's hope that this doesn't go on for too much longer, but I think we're in it for at least the 2021 fiscal year, and who knows how much longer. And one of the questions that's been coming up a lot in the work that I do for people is, should we be doing scenario planning? Should we be doing theory of change planning? Should we be doing strategic planning? These are all big questions, and nobody has any extra time because everybody is working and running 1,000,000 miles an hour trying to meet the needs of their populations. So you need to be very thoughtful and careful before you embark on any of these. But the questions that folks come to me around is, which of these processes should we embark on? And here's the things that you should consider as you're trying to decide this is, how might our program model need to change as a result of working in the pandemic? Should we be serving different target populations? And will our outcomes change? And how would we use this information? So based on how you would answer these questions, it could help you figure out which of these processes you might decide to embark on. Scenario planning is something that I just finished with another organization that found it incredibly useful. They had a strategic plan. They had done a theory of change. Their board wanted them to go back and revise their strategic plan. And the executive director pushed back and said, I don't think this is the right time to do strategic planning. We don't have the time to do that. We have a plan right now, but instead we need to prepare for a variety of different scenarios depending on what happens down the road, because we don't honestly know what's going to happen around COVID. And this was back in June when we really didn't know what was going to happen. I mean, we have a little bit more of a sense of what are happening right now, but I think there's still a lot of mystery in terms of what the next 6 to 12 months are going to be like. So he and I and his senior staff sat down and went through a scenario planning process. And there are a number of different articles out there right now defining scenario planning slightly differently. I really like this 5-step process I'm going to run over with you right now because it's very straightforward. The first thing you need to do is just to clarify what's your issue, which is, what are you trying to figure out right now? What are the questions that you have? Try and be as specific as possible. So, if the question is, are we going to be able to serve kids in person? Are we going to be able to keep our doors open? Are we going to have to let go of our staff? Like, what are the key driving issues that are bearing down on you that you need to figure out? After you've done that in step 2, you need to identify your driving forces. And they are the changes that you have no control over. So I did a huge brainstorm with these guys, and they came up with about 15 different possible driving forces, and then I forced them to vote, and we ended up refining it down to 2 key things in their case, which is real, but you need to go through the process because there are so many different things going on in our world, economically, socially, politically, from a public health standpoint. There is so much happening that you need to sort of go through that whole process and then really refine it and prioritize it down to just the top couple of key ones. When you do that in terms of the criteria setting, you need to look at how important these issues are and the degree of uncertainty, because you want to really be able to address what are the factors that are likely to force you to go in one scenario versus another. So that's what step 3 is, prioritizing those driving forces. And then what you do is you run them against each other. You run them sort of as a grid where you have a vertical and a horizontal, and you look at the 4 different quadrants of the different scenarios that come through based on those 2 forces. And I'm going to show you an example of one now. So here you can see an example for an organization that they defined their final 2 key driving forces is around the economics, whether we're going to have economic recovery. So it begins to happen or the economic growth is still in decline. And then they were a school program. Now, this is not the example this is from the article that's referenced here. This is not the organization I work with, but they were looking at schools. And so their other driving forces is whether schools open in the fall and schools are closed or very limited and there were no extracurriculars. And as you can see, they have 4 different scenarios. There's the purple, green, orange, and red. And so each one of those 4 squares represent a different scenario. So purple is healthy economic recovery and schools fully open. So probably your best case scenario. Well, red is your worst case scenario, which is the schools are closed and we're in economic crisis. And so for each one of those 4 colors, you ultimately then write up a scenario describing what those 4 different scenarios look like. And that's step number 4. Write a story about what life is like in each one of those 4 scenario boxes. And then step 5 is planning contingency around what if any of those 4 happen. In the case of the organization I just finished doing this with, they ended up looking at those 4 different scenarios, picking the 2 they thought were the most likely to occur, and then making a recommendation to the board around the one that they really believe and hope is going to happen. And that's the recommendation that the board then approved them to go forward and develop their next year's budget around. So they were using it as a board approval and budget development process from a scenario planning standpoint, but it also helped them think through all the possible issues that they could be encountering as they move into this next year planning. Any questions about scenario planning? Because I think it's a very powerful sort of intermediary point between theory of change processes and strategic planning, which I'm going to talk about in 1 second. Okay. Strategic planning, which most of you probably know about, but is a very different process. It's a plan usually that creates sort of a roadmap for your organization for the next 3 to 5 years. So it's a longer term outlook. It usually involves either around 3 to 6 months to fully implement, because it's a pretty in-depth, engaged planning process where you get key stakeholder input via surveys, and you do sometimes focus groups. You reflect and potentially revise your mission. You create vision and values if you don't already have them. And then you ultimately create a plan that has key goals, objectives, and strategic priorities. Strategic planning benefits from having some predictability for the future. And so right now, on September 30th, 2020, doing strategic planning would be tough because there's so much unpredictability for what's coming up in the next 3, 6, 12 months. If you don't have one though, and your board is demanding that you create one, it's fine to do it. You just need to be clear what are the limitations of being able to do something where you're trying to create a plan that looking out in the future that we just really don't know a lot of what's happening. So I'm finding that while groups have been coming to me looking for strategic planning processes, I've been encouraging them to think about doing scenario planning for the time being, with the hopes that 6 to 12 months from now, when we have a better sense of what's happening, then they can embark on strategic planning. All right, and so next steps. If you're thinking about doing one of these processes, the key thing to do is to meet with your staff leadership team, deciding what you really need to know. Do you really need to just do scenario planning because you're just trying to make some fundamental sort of short-term plans for the foreseeable future for the next fiscal year? Or do you really want to reflect all the way back and sort of think about who is your target population and what is your model? Pick a process. Set aside the time needed, which is a key thing about all this, because this is time. There's some time involved here, and you don't want to do this halfway. You want to do it to the best of your ability. So be realistic around what's available from your own perspective as the leader of your organization, and also in terms of collaborating with your key staff and other stakeholders that you decide to involve. And then absolutely share your thinking with your board. Any one of these three processes should be thought through and shared and rationalized with your board so that they're not surprised about what decision that you decide to make, because it's critical that they get behind whatever product you end up creating as a result of whatever process you engage in. And that is my overview, which I want to stop sharing this screen now so I can see your faces. Now it's very hard to do without seeing you. So I don't know if people have any questions or comments or concerns now as a result of hearing this. I'm happy to answer any questions or go into any specifics based on what's relevant for you, because this is your time. Yeah, Lily?
This is Lily. Yeah. This was very helpful. Really, really well explained, well delineated. Because my board, we've been talking and we're thinking of starting a strategic planning in January of 2021, but I really don't think that we have the capacity right now to do that. However, I have to say I was not familiar with scenario planning, so that seems to be, could be a much more pragmatic short term or vision for us to try to embark on. So thank you very much for that.
I had never heard of it before either. I mean, so I don't, maybe it had been around for a while and it just wasn't, central to work, but it seems, I was approached by one of my former clients to do it this summer. I started doing some digging around so I could get more on top of it. And then the articles just started coming. So all of a sudden now I have like 5 or 6 different versions of how you can do scenario planning. So it seems like it's the hot thing. And it honestly makes a lot of sense because there is just so much unknown. I mean, I wish it wasn't the case, right? I wish we could be doing strategic planning because I think that's what groups ultimately need, but we are living in very funny times. Yeah, go ahead.
I want to say that again, mimicking, this was very, very helpful. So thank you. It's interesting because we weren't using the language that you reflected in here, but I found our organization when we were trying to solve problems, we were actually doing a lot of these steps. So that gives me some confidence, and that's a lot. So thank you very much.
That's great. Any other thoughts or questions or considering, so does anybody think that this is something that they would consider bringing to their boards? I mean, it sounds like, so Lily's talking about maybe scenario planning. Anybody else think this is something that may be relevant in the next 3 to 6 months?
Yeah, absolutely. I was just digging through I don't think we have a strategic plan or a theory of change. I think when we were founded maybe, but that was like 15 years ago. So wow. Yeah, I think it's definitely time for something like this. This is very helpful. Thank you, Julia.
It's a nice way also, I mean, we're all living on screens these days, which is obviously thoroughly unpleasant after a while, but it is a way to really bring your staff together because you end up with some very clear shared consensus about who you are as an organization and who you're not, and what you're trying to do as an organization and what you're not. And so it is a good connecting experience that people seem, usually when I do them in person and I come to your offices and I'm writing up on the board like Vanna White and it's very energetic and engaging, but I've been finding you can do these remotely if you have to, just like we've learned we can do almost everything remotely if we have to. And at the end you have something that hopefully really helps you. I also find that funders are looking for either a strategic plan or a theory of change or some kind of business plan or strategy document that shows that you can communicate clearly to them where you're going and why you think you can get there. And so this is a way of having that.
Do you ever apply, so I think obviously the main implication of this is like kind of the relationship between the organization and the client. But moving towards like more democratic workplace environments and like non-hierarchical thinking, is there a way, have you ever used this tool kind of for those kinds of things?
I haven't, but to the question that was asked before about putting a client on the planning, I think it's a really powerful opportunity to do that. So I could do some digging around to find examples of folks who have. And the term I didn't include in this presentation, but I'm sure many of you have heard about, is logic model. And a logic model really is a very simple table similar to that table that you saw of the theory of change. The logic model, though, is really just a documentation of what you are. It's not a process that you go through. It's just a documentation engagement. But when I've done logic model documentation projects with organizations, I have involved clients very much of that, because it's really their voice around who you are as an organization and what they're experiencing that can come through in that. So I don't see any reason why a well-run theory of change process couldn't have a more decentralized, democratic orientation if it's done well, and if you've found the right group of people who can listen to each other and are comfortable with hearing different perspectives.
Hi, this is Linda. I just want to say that the presentation gave a lot of the little moving parts and pieces that we've been doing within the past month or many months. And it's helpful to know that we may have to do some modifications or adjustments, but it's there.
Great. And I mean, documentation, when I used to work with Sam at Hawthorne, we were involved in a project where she actually did have to do a lot of documentation on. She had she had a logic model, and she had very clear language because we worked together on a bunch of different evaluation things. So I know your organization has a history of being able to do that. And now the only question might be, Linda, is just, is it up to date? Does it really reflect who you are in 2020? You know, because groups change.
Thank you.
Sure. Anybody else have question or concern? Yeah, Lisa?
I'm just, you know, I'm looking at all of these items as tools. I'm just looking at the order that I think will be helpful for us. I think they all have their place. So we have a particular situation we have to make decisions on. So the scenario planning is like the #1 thing we need to do next. Thereafter, it's about programming, preparing our budget. So theory of change will help us with that. And then hopefully when we start to get a better idea of what's going to happen long term, we can then dig back into the strategic planning. So I feel like these are great tools that I can't wait to start using.
Great. And you may find that, you know, if you do scenario planning and it gets you far enough along that when you're done, we actually have some stability in our society, you could actually skip over theory of change and go right to strategic planning if your program model is stable. Like not everybody needs to do all 3 of these. They're all options depending on where you're at and what you need. So all of your organizations are at different stages in your organizational development. And, you know, as Andy was saying, you know, she's new to that role and maybe that organization doesn't have anything, versus in your case, Lisa, you may have it and you just need to do a little tweaking. So everybody's different. And I think you're absolutely right. These are tools for you to draw on as you assess what your individual organizational needs are. That's a really good point. Well, at the end, Eric and Dominique will send you this presentation. At the end of it is my email. So if people have follow-up questions, you should absolutely feel free to email me. I'm happy to sort of give you some help and help you figure out if it's not clear or any questions that you have around how to move forward to make this useful for you. To me, the goal of all these things is that it's applicable and that it's useful. I hate it to hear about people who waste their time. Your time is valuable. It's the most valuable resource that exists in your organization, you and your staff's time. So making sure that you select very carefully what you do and how you create these systems is what's most important to me. But I do feel like taking some time to step back and reflect and plan can help you make sure that that your staff and you are using your time in the most impactful way possible. People's lives are at stake right now in this world that we're living in. And so we have to be very thoughtful about how we're trying to help them and make sure that your organizations are having the maximum impact that they can. So if nobody has any other questions, Eric, I think that's it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Julia. We appreciate it. Thank you all for joining us. And we will be sharing the slides with the folks who attended, and we'll be editing and posting a recording of the session online as well.
Great. Thank you, everybody. So nice to meet you all. Good luck with what you do. You're doing great work.